happen to the role of the U.S. in the world economy? What will happen to the role of the dollar in the world economy? How strong are the financial systems of the world after a year of crisis, and what further reforms are needed of those systems and of regulatory systems of the financial system? How should we reform the pay of bankers, a subject of great interest to many in the audience? What are the long-term consequences for the roles of the market and the state in controlling the economy? What will happen, what are the consequences of this crisis for the shifting of the center of gravity of the global economy away from the West and towards Asia and the emerging market economies? To discuss these issues, we have an excellent panel, and I go in alphabetical order. It happens that it starts in alphabetical order by first name or by last name. First, Anne-Marie Idrac, the French Minister of State for Foreign Trade. Who has been minister since March this year. Previously, just before this, she was the CEO of the French railroad system. Before that, of the Paris Metro. In the 1990s, she was Minister of State for Transport, and she has a background of great experience, not only in the foreign trade area, but also in the area of infrastructure, and particularly transportation infrastructure. Baron David de Rothschild comes next alphabetically, which is okay by the B, but surprising by the R in his name. In his CV, it is stated, and I'll try and get this right, that he'll correct me if I'm wrong, that David de Rothschild is the great-great-great-great-grandson. Did I get that right? Of Mayor de Rothschild, and the descendant of the James de Rothschild who set up the French Rothschild Bank in 1812. My secretary yesterday was very excited when David and I met, because she's taking a course in political science, and she'd just been assigned the assignment of writing on the contribution of the Rothschild family to the history of Israel. And we all are very grateful for that contribution. Next is Axel Weber, the President of the Deutsche Bundesbank. He has been President of the Bundesbank for 6 years. Like an increasing number of central bankers, he was an academic before he became a central banker. The Bundesbank is in many ways at the heart of the system of European central banks. The ECB has taken over many of the operating principles and even more the underlying strengths of the Bundesbank, and as in his current role, he plays a critical part in the formulation of European monetary policy. He is not only a central banker, but he is a central banker. He's also about to become a regulator, because the German government has just decided to move bank regulation back into the Bundesbank, from which it had been removed in 2002, and some discussions are ongoing about the scope of the coverage of the regulatory system. So I imagine Axel will possibly talk about both central banking and regulation. Jim Wolfenson is a Renaissance man. best known as former president of the World Bank for 10 years, from 1995 to 2005, but during which he changed the role and the image of the World Bank, particularly in his willingness to deal for almost the first time with the issue of corruption, which is a very difficult issue for the bank, head on, and he made enormous strides in changing the bank's relationship with its members and in raising the profile of the bank, and more importantly, in doing much good work, not only vis-à-vis the least developed emerging countries, but also the countries of Eastern Europe, which were and the former Soviet Union, which were emerging at that time. But Jim is not only a former World Banker, he is currently an investment banker. He was one before that. He rose very high in Schroders in his first job in the Western Hemisphere. He grew up in Australia, and later rose very high in Solomon Brothers before setting up his own company, James Wolfenson, taking in as his partner an impressive figure in all dimensions, Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve System. When I say Jim is a Renaissance man, he is also a cellist. He also represented Australia as a fencer in the 1956 Olympics, and there's no field of human endeavor, as far as I can tell, in which he hasn't excelled. We have a fifth name on the schedule, Abby Joseph Cohen, who unfortunately damaged her leg and is in a wheelchair and was unable to come and is temporarily in a wheelchair, and apologizes very much for not being here. We will go in alphabetical order, with each speaker focusing on a particular aspect of the crisis and its implications. We have a very broad range of people, so the focusing is pretty natural. Minister Idrak will focus on political aspects of the crisis as seen from the viewpoint of the French government, the political and the regulatory aspects, and the changes that one is likely to see in the approach to the economy and to the financial sector by the political system. I quote David de Rothschild in saying that he will speak here in his role as the chairman of a modest private bank, and will say a few words in that role. It will be the view from the private sector. Axel Weber will speak on the crisis as seen by a central banker who is central to the discussions among central bankers and as a regulator. And Jim will focus on the crisis and its implications for the emerging market and developing world. So we really need to get on with the speakers and not with me. So I'll turn to Anne-Marie Idrak and ask you please to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President Perez, it is such an honor and a pleasure to participate in this exciting and high-level forum. Thank you very much for inviting me. As Professor Fischer said, my point of view won't be a financial one, but an economic and political one. My first point is trying to see where we are today, 13 months after Lehman Brothers' fall. In terms of public opinion, the governments have to answer very demanding questions from the people, 3 types of questions. And you will notice that they all are linked to confidence in the capitalist system as a whole. The first question is why and how could an American bankruptcy drag our real economy into such a recession? The second question is why the governments had to put such amounts of money into the financial system. And is this amount of money properly used? The third type of question is the gap between better economic and financial figures you can see on the paper and the still increasing rate of unemployment. I'm talking about Europe. As long as this unemployment situation won't be better, we can't say that the crisis is over. Indeed, encouraging signals show that a good path has been taken to exit the crisis. Particularly, the stimulus packages are quite efficient, but by nature, stimulus packages are temporary. As Professor Fisher said, there are still a lot of uncertainty and confusion as to know whether or not we are out of the difficulties. Coming to France, our economy is doing better than the other European economies. We expect a slightly positive growth for next year, and we are committed, under the impulse of Nicolas Sarkozy, to implement a program of various reforms in order to develop a more competitive and innovative economy. Coming to longer-term views, we think that the crisis is an opportunity to develop a new capitalist model. For that, we must first agree on what are the causes of the crisis. Let me here quote Nicolas Sarkozy in a speech delivered at the end of August. For him, the main cause of the financial crisis is, I'm quoting, an endless deregulation and blind trust in financial players' responsibility, which has led to widespread irresponsibility due to the search of quick profits. That's why France is working so hard with her partners to promote international financial rules based on transparency, regulation, and responsibility. The following speakers will talk in details, I'm sure, and with a high level of skill, with issues like the scope of regulation, accounting rules, banks' capitalization, and so on. Behind technicalities, the political debate comes to the limits of autoregulation, the need for contracyclical device, and the necessity to upgrade mid-term vision. In this context, fighting tax havens or trying to set more, decent rules and more mid-term oriented rules in terms of traders' bonuses are not only symbolic topics. They are important tools to secure the financial system itself and once again to bring back confidence. Beyond finance, this crisis is an opportunity for a new type of globalization, a renewed capitalism, in which, I'm quoting Nicolas Sarkozy again, everything, oil, commodities, wheat, stocks, shouldn't be subject to speculation apart from real economy. To build this new system, international cooperation is the only way. During last month, fortunately, the risk of protectionism has not had significant and effective damages. Another good news is improvement in terms of a government's capacity to cope together with common issues, this at the European level and at the global level. We think that the world matters can be discussed just between 7 or 8 countries. we must associate the emerging countries to the discussions. That's why France is so keen on promoting the G20 as the main place for monitoring global issues. When I talk about association, I mean that emerging countries should have duties and rights. For example, it has become clear that international cooperation needs to be enhanced in a way that puts significant emphasis on monitoring economies and exchange rates. The IMF will have to play a major role, particularly concerning the size of current account surplus and deficits. Pittsburgh G20 summit was important in that world leaders agreed that a framework for strong, sustainable and balanced growth is needed. I shall insist on the word balanced. In this new framework, domestic saving should rise in countries with large external deficit, while surplus countries are expected to develop domestic sources of growth. As finding for new paths of growth, education and R&D will be crucial. We believe that we should especially think green and look for growth in more environmentally friendly and less carbon dioxide intensive industries. Israel, like Europe and France, have a special role to play in terms of technology to reduce the dependence on oil and to fight against climate change. I was very impressed, Mr. President, by your speech about the commitment of Israel to green technology and your commitment to reduce the dangerous dependence on oil. I hope that water and energy could be interesting sectors to develop academic partnership and also joint investments between our two countries and between our companies, especially SMEs and the most innovative of them. Talking about green, of course, the Copenhagen conference will be a very interesting and turning point. To go still a little further in facing tomorrow, two last points. The new capitalism and new international cooperation we are looking for need an overall view. Don't forget that before being a finance crisis, the crisis was also a food crisis in many countries and a fuel crisis. We think that finance issues, trade issues, environment and social issues can be addressed separately with international institutions without links between them. That's why, for example, Nicolas Sarkozy invited ILO around the G20 table, and that we propose modalities in order to improve dialogue between WTO, ILO, and so on. The same idea of a more comprehensive approach of the economic, financial, and social issues leads to the question of measuring how well our economies are doing. Here comes the question of tools to measure performance in a less speculative and a more green world. That's why our President, as you may know, asked Professor Stiglitz, Professor Sen, and Professor Sitoussi to thank the measurement of economic performance and social progress. They have already identified the main limits in GDP as a sole indicator of performance and progress. And they have proposed a number of indicators which could be a new set of indicators in this new world according to the changes of our model of growth and also to the changes in the citizens' aspirations. We are talking about politics. Finally, as a conclusion, is we agree on the fact that the key factor of the crisis has been a lack of responsibility and of mid-long-term vision, then we know that the path for a new capitalism beyond the crisis lies in a better sense of responsibility with more comprehensive vision. This addresses citizens, finance people, companies, researchers. France also put interesting ideas on the table for government debate and for citizens' debate. The key point, as I said, is confidence. Mr. President, I want to tell you that your Looking for Tomorrow program gives us confidence. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great honor to address such a prestigious audience. Since the topic is tomorrow, I think I would say a few words about yesterday, a few words about today, and a few words about tomorrow. So if you look back in very brief words at what happened when this whole crisis started, it started by an unprecedented drama in the financial world, as you know. A large number of banks, and to a lesser extent insurance companies, went into very serious trouble. A big bank went bankrupt. Others became candidates to forced mergers, and quite a lot of banks were saved by government support. Israel, Mr. President, because of the cautiousness of the bankers and the talents of the supervisor, did obviously better than most. I think that unless you're 100 years old and still in activity, one can say that nobody in activity has seen a crisis of this magnitude, and one should never forget this. The financial industry came very close to a collapse and was saved by remarkable actions put in place by central bankers who provided liquidity in a variety of sophisticated forms to the banking industry, and by governments. And the governments obviously had to intervene in various forms, guaranteeing assets, buying assets, and taking stakes in many banks. This whole thing started in the summer of 2007, and I remember in London seeing the interbank market close almost within a night, which meant that for those who are not bankers, the liquidity that banks used to lend to one another suddenly disappeared. Have banks recovered? I turn toward, look to the governors. I think one can say globally, yes. Some remain fragile, but I think the situation of banks is vastly improved, or has vastly improved. Then the financial crisis was followed by a worldwide recession. And in this recession, although again some countries did much better than others, one can say that there was no decoupling. Everyone took a bit of the pain, some more than others. As you know, in a recession, you have at least 2 quarters. In this particular case, we had more than 2 quarters of negative output. We had a big drop in value of assets. We had a drop in corporate earnings. We saw massive destocking, massive deleveraging at the corporate level, and of course, massive deleveraging at the consumer, which means that the consumers stopped borrowing and started to rebuild their savings. And of course, when consumers rebuild saving and stop borrowing, it fuels recession, particularly in countries like the US, where the share of GDP coming from consumer spending is very high, and therefore, of course, you can't come back to a more healthy situation and expect to keep economic dynamism. Of course, many jobs were lost, but again, one could have gone into a severe deflation, which is a tragedy, Everyone has seen how complicated it is. Japan is a good case. When you start to be in a deflation, how you move out of it is extremely difficult. Deflation, again, was avoided by the fact that governments, central banks, in a very concerted and swift and intelligent reaction, put in place a number of stimulus packages which prevented this recession to transform itself into a major deflation. Now, where are we today? I think today stock markets have, as you know, recovered. There's been a great rally, particularly in the last 3 months. The question then is, this recovery, is it reflective completely or only partially of the situation of the real economy? And I think it is only partially reflective of the situation of the real economy. There is new equity available, i.e. fresh money, for people who want to raise money, subject to, the story making sense. Bond markets have reopened, and that segment is extremely active. Credit spreads have improved, and corporate earnings seem to have stabilized. So there are some clearly positive aspects today. But unemployment is still increasing, and I believe that no one can talk of a final recovery while people are still losing their jobs. Now, at the macroeconomic level, what are we seeing today? Again, I'm the layman in that subject. I think the recovery process, contrary to what happened when the recession started, has shown some decoupling. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you take, for instance, China, the shape of the recovery is a V. It's gone down, spent a lot of money, did intelligent things, had a lot of reserves, started with a lot of money, and now is back into growth. Western Europe is probably the shape of an L, and I think we all hope to see the L slowly becoming a U. The question is, how long will it be an L, and when will it become a U? And of course the fear is that it doesn't become a U but becomes a W, which means that there's another element of setback, rightly or wrongly, my own view, because I'm an optimist. President Perez says that optimists and pessimists live the same way, so might as well live as an optimist. I think there will be blips, there will be dents, there will be moments which might be difficult, but there's not going to be a major setback. In our business, we're still very busy working at helping corporates reshape, restructure their balance sheet, but investments are coming back, and we are seeing a modest pickup in the mergers and acquisition market. Not what it was in the first half of 2007, but better than what it was in the last 12 months. Now, tomorrow. Tomorrow is obviously a more difficult question. It's easy to analyze the past. It's not so easy to forecast the future. Couple of questions. First of all, behaviors. The common view is that when a crisis is over, one forgets very quickly, and one goes back to one's bad habits. Again, maybe I'm naive, probably am, but I find it hard to believe that business, and particularly in the financial and the banking sector, will not remember what happened. Obviously, banks will have to follow new rules put in place by regulators, but the question is, will all this happen because we are forced, as an industry already very regulated, to do things new because regulators have asked us to do things new, or will they be a sort of voluntary change in behavior? And to put it in very simple terms, will people understand that more transparency is needed when it comes to bank, less complexity, maybe a better quality earnings than just a quantity of earnings, and of course accountability. I leave the legal side apart, moral accountability on the part of senior management when it comes to running institutions like bank. The second element of behavior is, of course, that it's fair to say that it's too easy when a crisis of that magnitude starts to be behind us and one sees the world improve. It's too easy to sort of think that we will go quickly back to where we were before. I don't think that is true. So it means that people such as myself and others who work in Western Europe, i.e. in countries where growth will not be as strong as it was in the past, how do you preserve your profit, your level of activity in a changing environment? Well, obviously, you have to accept the idea that you've got to work more, that you probably have to earn less, that you've got to be more imaginative, more innovative, more aggressive, and gain new shares of market. And in this exercise of gaining new shares of market, I would like to have Jim's view about new market means investing in emerging markets, and then can one come to a situation where there's a level playing field, i.e. we are open to foreign investment coming in our own countries? Will we be able to offset some of the decline in our activity within our own markets in investing in other markets, and will we be welcome? That's obviously a question that stems from living in a place where there's less growth. Of course, there's another question which is not of my competence, but again, we may get some answers from the governors, is that the governments have avoided, again, the crisis becoming a major deflation, and they've put in place a lot of stimulus packages, but the stimulus packages mean that the level of debt in a number of countries is extremely high, and at least in an unprecedented level. So what will countries do? They will probably clamp down on expenses. So there's a limit to how much you can limit public expense. They will increase taxes, unpleasant but probably difficult to avoid. And this will have, of course, a negative impact on growth. Now, some people say inflation will sort it out. I don't think inflation is something central bankers enjoy particularly. And I also think that if there was inflation and interest rates have to be risen very rapidly, there would be a collapse in the bond market, and this would be very, very, very negative, because there's a huge amount of bonds outstanding there, and the drop in value would have, again, negative effects. So, you know, quite a few questions ahead of us, and I'd like to stop this by just saying two things. One, I think Israel is an example of having weathered the crisis well, is an example of a country that with energy, vitality, willpower, used to overcoming obstacles, has done better, and therefore it's a lesson, you know, for people who might be too complacent or who lived in an environment where easy money was too easy. I'd also would like to say something a little bit technical, and I apologize, but when crises like this one occur, things that were loved become hated. So leverage buyouts, it's horrible. Hedge funds are dramatic. Securitization is a horrible word. I just would like to leave with the thought that none of those three elements are as such negative. They're, in my view, very positive. The problem is use them properly with the right level of risk and with the right pricing. Because as you move into a world where banks will be probably, if not smaller, probably be less leverage, less gearing, will have to have more capital, then it means that probably macro level they will lend less than they used to lend in the past. And in order to fuel growth in the world, you need available money to go towards investment and not just stay in saving accounts. Therefore, you need to find ways of having money that is not necessarily coming from banks, redirected to investments, and that's why those instruments are essential. The problem, again, is using them properly. Thank you for your patience.
Mr. President, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to speak at this prestigious event here in Jerusalem. Let me take off from where the previous speakers started also. We saw also in 2007 a massive reduction in liquidity in money markets. We saw it from the other side, not from the bank side. We saw it from the central bank side. And our first intervention at the European Central Bank was the most massive one the institution had ever undertaken since its start. Since then, we had several rounds of tensions in money markets, but we didn't really have a widespread crisis. A widespread crisis came when Lehman Brothers defaulted and went into bankruptcy. From that moment on, the tensions that were limited to the financial markets and to banking in particular both affected the emerging market economies in a very rapid fashion. There was a worldwide deterioration of economic conditions, and what used to be a financial crisis became a full-blown economic crisis, the worst recession in post-war history. Now, when I look back at what happened really after Lehman Brothers, my view was this was a crisis of confidence. And it was not just a crisis of confidence in other parties in financial markets. What we saw in many discussions with the banks, it was a crisis of self-confidence in money markets. Banks simply moved to panic mode after the default of Lehman Brothers because nobody knew whether they were able to save their own institution, let alone have trust in the ability of others to save their institutions. And I think this really caused a major crunch in credit availability immediately. Finance markets dried up, liquidity dried up, and central banks had to intervene in an unprecedented scale and scope in these markets. Now, the central bank intervention, in my view, was only done to buy time. And we did that in Europe too, as our American counterparties. We bought time for governments to act. And as you know, some of the government action programs, like the bank rescue programs or the conjunctural programs, need to go through a legislatory process. And just to give you an example, the fastest law ever passed in Germany, post-war history, was the bank rescue program. It was passed through both houses, upper house and lower house, within a week. Usually, parliamentary processes in Germany take up to a quarter of a year, run on regular schedule. So it was a massive intervention, very much front-loaded in time. Now, where do we stand now? Financial markets, optimism is now again more widespread. There is significant improvements in many market conditions, stock market prices, spreads, bond yields, all of these have improved. They have improved even more so than the real economy, which I find somewhat concerning. The situation, in my view, is still fragile, and I don't rule out that temporary backlashes are likely to occur. Now, you also have to understand that stabilization is not just due to better macroeconomic performance and the leveling off of risk aversion. It is also due to unprecedented intervention and stabilization measures on the part of the government and the central bank sector. Banks are still exhibiting weaknesses, and I think that at least for most of our domestic exposures, the strong recession that we've just seen in the corporate sector will lead to further bank losses, not in the part of structured finance in banks, but on the part of domestic credit exposures. It is usually happening a half a year after the downturn in the economy, so I expect the next 2 years to be basically characterized by some major losses also in banks' balance sheets due to domestic exposures. And also, Stan mentioned at the start, there is still high levels of uncertainty in the markets. Volatility in markets is still high, and I really fear that this is not the point for renewed irrational exuberance. Now, for me, I want to touch on two things. Given this analysis where we stand, where do we go from here? I think it's fair to say that the worst is probably over in financial markets. However, given that, I think before optimism returns in full-blown fashion, we only have a small window of opportunity for all the reforms of the financial sector that are needed in order to not have the same situation again that we saw. The consequences of the crisis have created, at least at the G20 level, an urgency and a willingness to act mode that is unprecedented, and it must be put into action now. We owe this to the public. This is my firm view. The immense cost of this financial crisis that were imposed on public finances and on future generations simply demand that things like what we've seen cannot happen again. Now, there are two areas that I'd like to focus on. First is on banks. Banks are still the primary link between financial system and the real economy. It is true that regulation and oversight have to be extended to all systemically relevant parts of financial institutions, so we need to deal also with the banking and the shadow banking system. But better regulation for banks, in my view, is the most important building block of a new financial stable system. And it is essential to improve banks in all dimensions. First, we need better risk management practices. We need better capital, and better capital means we need higher levels of capital in banks, and we need better quality, full risk absorbing forms of capital to cushion against future losses. And this crisis has shown liquidity is not always available at almost zero cost, so banks need to economize on liquidity, and we need liquidity requirements within the framework of the regulatory standards like Basel II. Now, we also need to address the causes of the crisis, and that means we need to not just modify the regulatory framework, we need to take banking supervision one step further. What do I mean by that? We need to take banking supervision in an era where it is insufficient to safeguard the stability of each individual bank at the microprudential level as regulators. That is fine, but macroprudential issues are very important, so systemic risk needs to be identified and combated. A good picture to show how this works is if you look at the strengths of each link in a chain, each link may be solid, but the strength of the chain is always only as strong as its weakest link. And this is what we've seen in the banking industry. We need to improve systemic supervision. We need to improve macroprudential aspects in supervision. And as Stan said before, I think central banks are the core institutions that have all along focused on macro issues and macroprudential issues. And this is, in my view, one of the reasons why central banks will around the globe get a larger role in banking supervision to basically bring macroprudential aspects into microprudential regulation. We also need to flesh out the details of the new regulatory reform. We need a consistent framework that is the same across the globe. And I represent Germany on the steering committee of the Financial Stability Board. I can tell you, if we do not succeed on having similar global standards on banking supervision, on capital requirements, on liquidity requirements, and a convergence of the accounting framework, we will fail with banking supervision to prevent things like the ones that have happened now. Because we will be under the illusion that things that look the same are the same, but if you look deeper, they're not. And this is an important issue for me, so whatever we can achieve individually is fine. Whatever we can achieve globally is decisive. And the new banking supervisory standards will only be as good as what we agree globally to impose in all our systems. Now, let me also add a few words on the way forward. On the way forward, it is important to say where we stand now is very much driven, in my view, by politics. Politics has issued a systemic insurance for all players in the market. And it has taken things much too short to look only at institutions that have profited directly from intervention by central banks or by governments. Everybody has profited. A fall of major financial institutions would have led to a devastating effect on all financial institutions. And the key issue for the future is how do we take out this implicit put that is now in the market. So exit strategies are at the core of what we need to discuss. We need a credible exit framework in three dimensions. First of all, central banks need a credible exit. And I think that credible exit, in my view, will be warranted and will be implemented in my view, not such a difficult fashion. For us central banks, price stability always was the primary objective. It will remain the primary objective. And in the heat of the crisis, I was very often confronted by two schools in Germany saying, the one said, there is deflation ahead. And the other school said, there is massive inflation ahead. And it was roughly half and half of the observers of the central banks asked, what is your likely outcome? My answer was, the most likely state in the future will be price stability. Because we have independent central banks, we have a clear mandate, we're willing to execute exactly this mandate. We will not be popular when we do this, but we will do it nevertheless. This is why we were given independence. And so for me, the most likely thing in the future, in terms of description of central bank outcomes, will be sustained price stability even in the years ahead, which will be difficult years. But we need an exit also for fiscal policy, and I think that exit is much more difficult. Fiscal policy has blown up deficits in an unprecedented scale. We need to structurally rebalance these deficits. Most of the deficits we've seen are structural. So the hope that future growth will undermine these deficits is simply not warranted. We need structural adjustment to move to balance. And therefore, we need to cap deficits. We need to basically consolidate the budgets. We need to restore confidence in public finance. We need new room to maneuver for future policy. And let me tell you, coming from Germany, we need to prepare the budgets for the immense fiscal burdens of aging that will face our society. And if we don't do that in time, we will simply pose higher and higher costs on future generations, which in my view would be devastating for the acceptance both of policy and of the dealing with this crisis in the eyes of the future generations. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm assigned by Stan the task of talking about a part of the world that has scarcely been mentioned this morning. It's a part of the world which is of increasing importance and which in the years to come is going to be perhaps at the forefront of discussions as distinct from the back end of discussions. And I talk about the developing world. The developing world, in rough terms, amounts to 5.5 billion people on a planet of 6.5 billion. There are about 1 billion people in the rich world, as we know it, and there are 5.5 billion in the developing world. And by 2050, not too far away, we expect our world to have grown from 6.5 billion people to 9 billion people, with the 1 billion people in the rich world maybe being 1.1 billion, and the people in the developing world growing at that time to 8 billion people. So you will have a world in which 8/9 of the world, roughly, will be in the developing world, and we'll still have our 1 billion plus in the rich world. The important thing that is happening is not just the growth in demographics. It is a complete change in the structure of the economics of our planet. So that discussions by our successors some years from now are likely to be, when President Perez is running his conference some 30 or 40 years from now, and we look forward to that possibility. We cannot imagine it without him. It's unlikely that you will have a group of Europeans and an Australian who has come to live in the United States sitting here, but you will have a Chinese and an Indian and a Brazilian and maybe a Russian. And if we're lucky, you'll have someone representing the group of speakers that is here this morning. And perhaps you will still have Chairman in Stan Fisher, who I hope will still be around to chair the conference. But the important thing that you have to understand is that it is not just the number of people that is changing, it is the balance that most of the people in this room, and certainly on our panel, have grown up with. We've grown up, I think I can say, with a feeling that the rich countries, 1 billion people out of, let's say, 6 billion at the turn of the century, that this 1 billion people was entitled to 80% of the income. And we all grew up with this. And I can tell you, as having worked in the World Bank, that I had to fight very hard at World Bank meetings and IMF meetings to get the attention of people like Axel and others on the developing world. I'm sure the Minister, if she had been there, would have been much more sensitive from her remarks. But this is not surprising, because for 30 years, from 1970 to the year 2000, the rich countries more or less had 80% of the global GDP. And in fact, the G7 had 65% of the global GDP, and it varied by 2 or 3% a year, but always around that level. What is happening today is that 80% that we talked about is being eroded, and we're seeing a shift to these developing countries. And to give you an idea of that shift, it's dropped from 80 to something around 70 or a little bit more. And the projections are that by 2025, that will drop again from 65 to maybe 45 to 50. And by 2050, you will have again what we last had in the year 1500 and the year 1820, China and India being 50% of the global GDP. 50% of the global GDP. For people of my generation, that's extremely difficult to contemplate, to understand. And maybe the projections are wrong. Maybe it's not 50%, maybe it's 45%, or it's 42%, or it's 10 years later. The truth of the matter is that the whole dynamics are dynamics of a move to the world of development. And that's something that we, and this panel, and the world has to understand. And quite honestly, from my 10 years at the bank, I can tell you it's heavy slogging trying to get people to focus on the changes, not only about those that are becoming more wealthy, but to get them to focus also on the pervasive influence of poverty. And, by the way, a related issue, which is the issue of environment, as we try to bring along the development of our planet. And so looking forward, as Axel was talking about, and as the other speakers were talking about, we have to have a change of mind. We have to have a change of understanding. And for many years, Israel was extraordinarily active in development, and very sadly, in my judgment, they have reduced the amount of financial involvement in the developing world, and hopefully will restore it because they have a lot of the technology, the skills, and the understanding that were so important and are so important to sectors of the world that are in poverty. And let me give you one other statistic. The other statistic that you should understand is that Africa and the poorest countries, which now more or less are 1 billion people out of the 6.5, in terms of people that live under $1 a day or $1.25 a day in terms of income. This group will grow in Africa and some smaller countries or some lesser countries but important in Asia. They will constitute 25% of the world's population. 25%. So it'll be around 2.3 billion people. And the numbers, very roughly, and there are many, many estimates of this, but to give you a sense of it, today that group of people has an average per capita income of $700 or $800 a year. By 2050, the estimates are that it'll be anywhere between $1,700 a year and $3,000 a year. Let's take the highest estimate, $3,000. At the same time, in 2050, the estimates are that China and India will not be at $3,000, but will be at $40,000 per capita. That 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in China and India. 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in China and India. Above that will be a group of countries, including some oil producers in this part of the world, which will be maybe $50,000 per capita. And then the rich countries that many of us represent will be, on those same estimates, $100,000 per capita. So you have a gap in the world of 100,000 to 1 billion rich people, down to 2.5 billion people, that have, let's say, $3,000 per capita. 100,000, 3,000. With a quarter of the world around 3,000. Let's make it 4,000. Make it 5,000. Reduce the 100,000 to 80,000. Reduce China and India from 40,000 to 30,000. The important point is that it is an unstable world. This is not a world of people in poverty running around carrying spears, not knowing what is going on in the rest of the world, hunting, trying to feed their kids, eking out some agricultural future. This is a group of people that have earpieces, that have cellular radios, that are well informed on what is going on in the world, and, not surprisingly, subject to influences, all of which may not be positive. There are many influences that are trying to disrupt our planet. And so this issue of poverty is not just an issue for specialists, not just for people like me who could only get a job in the World Bank because I couldn't get a job in the central banks and had to eke out an existence in that field. It is for all of you. It's for our kids. It is the primary issue in terms of the future. This tectonic shift from the rich countries to the developing countries. This tectonic shift which is reflected in so many ways in terms of the environmental conference which is coming up in Copenhagen, which is reflected in the influence and the role of women, which is reflected in the influence and the role of education throughout the world, of healthcare, which have been touched upon. This is, for me, the central point that I have been allowed to make. And let me make one last point in the region. You have, in the region, 350 million Arabs. 60% of that Arab community is under the age of 25. 100 million are between the ages of 15 and 25. 100 million. They need 4 to 5 million jobs a year. They are currently getting maybe 2 million jobs a year. They are being delayed in their opportunity to get work. They're becoming frustrated, and that group is growing. It is crucially important that we take every effort that we can to get those young people employed. There is a role when President Perez is finished with the modest effort of peace. There is a tremendous role in which Israel can provide the technology, the know-how, the skills to the Arab world to get that group of young people more effective and more working. A group of young people that are unemployed is not a great thing to have in any country. It is a very difficult thing to have in this region. And so, as we look forward, I simply say to you, think of the changing balance. Think of the move from Europe to Asia, which existed before. Think of the role of young people, and think in terms of your neighbors, of how, hopefully, with peace and better understanding, Israel can help. Thank you very much.
I wonder if we could get a microphone up here so people can answer, on the stage, can answer questions. I'd like, first of all, to thank all the panelists for those very, very interesting comments, and start by addressing a question which I think is relevant to all 4 of the panelists, which Jim's presentation in particular raised. This crisis has accelerated the movement of control of the global economic system from the G7 or G8 countries, which Minister Idrak talked about, to the G20. And that sounds like a terrific thing because it means it's more inclusive. Jim, the question I have for you and for the others is, are we developing another group of rich countries who, as they become richer, will pay precisely the same amount of attention to the poorest countries as the previously rich countries did? Or is there any reason to think that as the G20 develops, the center of focus of their activities will be more all-inclusive?
Technically, is that working? Good. The answer, I think, Stan, is that at the moment there is a nominal recognition which is present in every G20 statement, usually paragraph 23 or 24, that we need to deal with development, and we need to deal with this group of people that I described. The truth of the matter is that not much is happening. Not nearly enough is happening, except in the case of the changing balance between China and India and the developing countries. What is fascinating to me is that when you go to Africa today, just taking one area of the world so I can be brief, there are now 750,000 resident Chinese in Africa. Just about every president's home, just about every sports facility, just about every town hall is built by the Chinese. If you go out to see developments, they're not only financed by the Chinese, but they have been built by the Chinese. There is a colossal recognition between China and India and these developing countries, so much so that for the first time 2 to 3 years ago, the heads of African government met in Beijing and 400 businessmen met in India. This direction is the thing that we need to look at, and to be quite frank, I fear that the rest of us outside China and India are making lip service to it but not doing nearly enough. I'm sure that's incorrect in the case of France and Germany and the people that are represented here, but it is in relation to the other countries, so perhaps I can ask them to comment.
Well, Stan, my view is that we need to adapt the global landscape in all these committees, G whatever, to deal with the problem. And we cannot, if we want to act responsibly, take too much account of those that feel an inclusive, small meeting is better than a larger one where many feel excluded if we're in the smaller format, that should drive the discussion at the debate. It needs to be as inclusive as is needed to solve the problem. And I think the G20 clearly was needed to deal with the global outfall of this financial crisis. If we talk about more substantial growth issues, global division of labor, probably the G20 is still too exclusive. But when we discuss the immediate dealing with the outfall of the crisis, G20 was sufficiently inclusive to rapidly deal with the problem. But I would say it's an interim step. We need to basically include all those that have a voice at the global level also in taking decisions. Otherwise, representation is not fair.
Just one word to add that, as I said, Copenhagen will be very important. Not only on the substance, I mean climate change and how to share the responsibility between developed countries and developing countries, and we hope that everybody will take its part of the common responsibility and the common burden according to its level of development, according to its energy mitigation. But besides and beyond the substance, climate change, Copenhagen is very interesting in terms of process, in terms of governance, because you have technology aspects, finance aspects, way of life aspects, and the very, very important question of balance between poor countries, emerging countries, which are too often put in the same pool, as they are not. There are different situations and developing country. So I think that Copenhagen really should be looked with various aspects, and especially this aspect of governance. Inside the G20, at the moment, there is still a difference between what developed countries, the G7, are interested about. That's to say, essentially, at the moment, finance question, regulation, and so on. And the other emerging countries, the new ones, who are especially interested about fighting protectionism and the reform of the IMF, and the reform of the seats and rights of votes in the IMF, which is not exactly the same. So it is very difficult for us developed countries to share the power, to share the shares around the tables, and to share the market shares in terms of economy and in terms of influence, intellectual influence. But that is tomorrow, as it was so excellently said.
Thanks very much. Just for those of you who, you all probably know that there's a conference in Copenhagen on climate change in, I think in December. And Minister Idrak was referring to that in her first set of comments. I'd like to ask one more question and then turn to the audience for questions. If you're preparing a speech, please turn it into a question that you can ask briefly when we turn to you. The second question I have for the panel is, a year ago there was a whole lot about changes in the role of the state in the economy, more intrusive role for the state, lots of reference to the fact that the United States the United States government was becoming a major owner of American industry and the financial system. But when I listened to three of the four speakers, the focus was very much on the financial sector. Question, was the issue essentially a financial sector issue, which if we straighten it out for the industrialized countries and the rest, we will have dealt with the causes, the prime causes of this crisis? Or was there something deeper and even more worrying involved in this crisis that we will fail to deal with if we focus only on the financial sector? And I look for volunteers to start answering this question. I see David is willing.
Look, I think a lot of people thought or imagined that in a way the financial crisis was an opportunity for governments who tend to be easily intrusive to come in and sort of, if you would, control the direction of the world economy by having a stake in banks. I think, in 1982, I've experienced the nationalization of my own family bank when the communists and socialists came running France, when the rest of the world was privatizing. So I know what political intervention in banks is. I think there's nothing of that kind in today's crisis. I think it was basically rescue. I hope they'll make money, probably will, because as the banks get in a healthier position, states will make capital gains in reselling. Now, what are the implications going further, and what are the things one might have missed or not? I will let the governor of the Bundesbank respond, but I don't think, seen from the private sector, that it was anything else than a welcome temporary bailout.
Axel?
Well, let me put it like this. Governments try to focus on the immediate action in the financial sphere. But there was also a fallout, as we said before, from the financial markets onto the real economy. And in particular in Germany, I can tell you it caused major disruptions in three industries. One was export-oriented investment production, capital goods production. That really declined, but it has restarted. We are seeing exports in those areas without government intervention increase. The second industry very hard hit in Germany was the car industry. And there were single interventions in trying to basically support capital for a transition period for those industries to survive. Some of them have failed, as have other government interventions, in trying to bridge the time between the immediate fallout and the restarting of financial markets. And I'm very cautious about governments doing this because governments are not the better entrepreneurs, and usually these decisions are much more tedious to take at government level. A third area where governments did rightly intervene was where there was a shortage of the supply of credit or capital through financial markets. But it was done basically by fostering financial firms, by giving them capital, by providing them with liquidity, and by voicing the clear expectation that this support is passed on to firms in the real economy. It is starting to work. It is still something that we need to work at. The credit channel is still somewhat clogged, but we don't see a credit crunch. But in particular, small, medium-sized enterprises do have some problems. The larger they are and the more they're involved at the global level, the more difficult their access to credit in the future, in the months ahead will be. So we need to work at that problem. But in general, no direct intervention of governments in industry.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Let's turn to the audience, and please raise your hands over here. I've got a couple of spare mics if somebody would...
Hi, Sam Solomon, New York. Used to work at Lehman Brothers. Actually, if you could, many years ago, if you could spend a little bit of time, if you don't mind, on foreign exchange rates, strength of the dollar, various currencies, and also, if you don't mind commenting on this push on the part of certain countries to get away from a dollar-denominated oriented economy, and your views on that in the medium term.
Thanks. Why don't we collect 2 or 3 more questions, and then Axel, that one was for you. Let's see further back. Back there with the T-shirt on. Yep. You're going to get a microphone, and if you could identify yourself, please.
Based on my own country's experience, the UK, when governments poured vast sums of taxpayers' money into the economy, back into the banks, should they not have imposed some conditions that meant that the first people to benefit would have been the people and not the banks themselves? And how can you bring back confidence to the person who has lost their job, their pension, their house, and are seeing banks beginning to post profits again and bonuses?
Thanks. Way back there, standing up. Again, could you get a mic there, please? And please identify yourself as well.
Good morning. My name is Bill Hess from the United States. I'm with the World Zionist Organization. I'm interested to know from Mr. Wilson's presentation what the percentage of Arab bank money would be and how the Arab banking system would fit into the world global order that you're proposing.
Thanks. Ken Bielkin, here in the second row, please. Could you bring a mic here, please? Thanks.
Thank you. Kenneth Bialkin, in the United States. In the tectonic shift that Jim Wolfenson speaks about to China and India for great expansion and development, the implication is that that could be a negative implication for the rich countries, because if wealth is moving from the rich to the poor, will the rich become poor? My question is, doesn't this tremendous growth in this tectonic shift present a tremendous opportunity for worldwide prosperity and growth, in which the developed countries, having access and facilities and experience, should be able to participate, at least as the facilitators of this great expansion? Or is it all bad news and not good news?
Thanks very much. Let's turn to the panelists. We'll ask Axel to give us a full description on and prediction of what is going to happen to exchange rates in the global economy.
Well, Stan, as you know, I always full-heartedly stick to the G7 commitment and the statement that we've made and not go any step further. Coming from academia and seeing Jacob here in the room, we all know that we got a roughly 50% chance to predict the direction right. So I will refrain from any additional comments on the exchange rates, even so you might think that's a boring comment from a central banker. On the general more question, and I wouldn't like to focus on any other country except for the one where we partly helped some of the bank rescue programs to be put in place, it is indeed a period where I think some of the returns we're now seeing in the banking industry are largely the result of the systemic insurance that was given by the intervention of governments to financial markets globally. So the expectation probably that was expressed in the question is adequate, that given the returns and the fact that they are basically brought about by the intervention of governments, you would expect that banks, in particular in view of capital standards that would increase, will use the current profits to strengthen their capital base out of their own returns. And that means that probably this year of the systemic rescue is not the year for large-scale bonuses or dividends. It is the year for strengthening capital, both quality and quantity in banks. And as was expressed in the question, I think the expectation from the political side is that that will determine what is done at the end of the year with returns that will materialize in the banking industry. So far, the year has been better than expected for most of the banks. They should have more than anticipated capital buffers built up by the end of the year. That's my clear expectations, and I've expressed that in the past.
Thanks. Minister Idrak, particularly on the question of how the political system is going to deal, or how the world will deal with the concerns about unemployment as the banking system seems to recover, but the real system is some way behind.
I'm sorry, I won't answer about that. But about the question of balance in terms of saving countries and consuming countries. And behind that, of course, the concern we have as Europeans about the level of euro versus dollar. But to discuss about the level of all these currencies, there's again a question of table, because we should have together China, Japan, European and Americans. And this, let's say, G4 doesn't exist. Another point is very interesting about the last question concerning the opportunities offered by the growth of China and India, and especially by the fantastic growth of mid-class population, as it was said. I think that we developed, and we European countries should improve our efforts to address these markets and this population, as we try to do in France. An important point is that when we are talking with Chinese and with Indian people, I will be in India next Sunday, they don't want to talk only about markets, about opening markets. That's one of the reasons of the difficulties for the WTO, the discussions. They want to talk about partnership. They want to talk about sharing the knowledge. They have, and they will have, not only as many, but more engineers than we, industrialized country, have, including female engineers, which is quite a problem in Europe. So the question is not only how to improve the trade, how to fight against protectionism in terms of exchanges of goods, but the question is how to develop partnership, joint across investments, joint across efforts to improve technology and to improve the sharing of the wealth. So it's also another type of exchanges you have to think about.
Thanks very much. If I could embroider on that, David, you'll be next up if you can grab the mic, but I'd just like to make a comment. Before this crisis, the world had focused on the fact that the U.S. current account deficit was massive and unsustainable, and that the largest consistent surplus on the other side of the balance sheet was the Chinese current account surplus, and that some adjustment had to be made there. What Minister Edrak was referring to in talking about the G4 was that the main parties involved in that would be the United States, China, Europe, and possibly the oil-producing countries, or some other group like that. And that group doesn't meet, and that problem hasn't been dealt with yet. It's being dealt with partly by the fact that there's a major recession in the United States that has reduced imports. But it is a macroeconomic issue that will face us, and that needs to be discussed in a relatively small group, not the G30 particularly, and that isn't happening at present. David?
On the lady's question about the UK banks? Or what?
Any of the questions?
No, I mean, I have sympathy for the lady's question on the UK banks, because I'm also, although a Frenchman, a UK banker. I can only say that the big banks in the UK grew enormously, that if they hadn't been supported by the UK government, the tragedy in terms of overall economic situation and jobs would have been much worse than it has been now. So I think you shouldn't regret the fact that tax money went into those banks. And of course, as you heard from all the authorities in the UK, people are focusing now on what is fair compensation and what is not fair compensation, which is obviously a difficult question because there's a moral issue and there's a market issue, and one has to find the balance between the moral and the market issue. And of course, the key point is that bonuses have to be spread over 2 or 3 years, which we do in our firm since a long time, so that if people misbehave or have lost what they've earned a year before, or are not good citizens in the firm, they can be sanctioned.
Thanks. Jim, please.
Questions that I can comment on. One was the Arab banking system and how big it is. And there we should understand that at the moment of the world's foreign exchange reserves of close to $9,000 billion, 9 trillion, the largest is China, with a bit over 2,000 trillion. The second is Japan with 1,000 billion. The third is Europe with about 500 billion, if I'm correct, Governor. And then below that are a bunch of other countries, which include some of the Arab countries, but they're measured in the hundreds of billions, not in the trillions. And then, interestingly enough, in terms of foreign exchange, comes the United States with 80 billion. So, but it does print the money, and the question is how valuable is that dollar going to be, but that's a separate question. So I would say that the Arab countries are certainly on a per capita basis extremely rich. They're individual fortunes. But today, if you think about the global situation, I would be looking first today at China. And in the question that was asked about the tectonic shift, I'd make 2 quick points. The first is, does not the growth of, the question was, the growth in the developing countries have a tremendous opportunity for the rich countries to enter? And the answer would be yes, except that the competitive position of the rich countries is diminishing. And I can tell you just one set of statistics in relation to the United States. There is studying today in the United States approximately 120,000 Chinese, 120,000, and a little less than that in terms of Indians. The number of Americans studying in China is 11,000, and the number of Americans studying in India is 2,800. The other point that I would make is that we always regarded China and India as low-cost countries, and that was their advantage. The truth of the matter is that they have been low-cost, but they've become more efficient in manufacturing. The second thing is that in terms of technology, in which we had the lead, you have only to look at the Chinese and Indians who are at the lead in terms of technology. And in terms of service industries, which is the third level, if you're in the United States and you're buying from a supermarket, there's a fair chance that when you call in to inquire about your order, that it will be answered in Mumbai or in China, in relatively good English. So we are really being challenged, and we have to deal with it at the level of education, at the level of understanding, and recognizing that we need to become more competitive. That is the role for the next generation, but as leaders in this room, we need to redirect what we're doing.
Thanks very much. We have approximately 3 minutes left, so that means 1.5 questions. One over there, please. Lady with the... Would somebody take the mic over there, please? The lady is standing up. Could we get a microphone over here, please?
My name is Renate Toast-Stetzler, coming from Germany. I'm a business lady. Thank you so much for your status. And my question is, by finding answers, does the answers you find in the oldest book, in the Holy Bible, play a role? And when yes, what kind of role does it play finding answers, worldwide, globally?
Thanks very much. One more question, please, and just in the interest of fairness, we'll go way back over there where there's somebody standing with their hand up. Could they get a mic, please?
Shalom, I'm Sarah Bloom, French student at Hebrew U. Mr. Wolfenson, you talked about the high percentage of young people in the Middle East and the high unemployment that touched them. And you make the link between this unemployment and the problems of frustrations that can lead to a socio-political crisis in the Middle East. But actually, a lot of those young are qualified. They go to Arab university or even Israeli ones. Don't you think the problem is rather about the lack of will of initiative from the Arab governments? And, and do you have any idea about how the wealthiest country can influence and boost economically and politically speaking the Arab governments on this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're out of time. We started a bit late, but we can't go on any longer. We have 2 nice, easy questions for any of you who wish to volunteer. If you want to refer to the 10 Commandments and say they're a good basis for economic behavior, that might be one possible answer, but I don't know if any of you have wished to comment on either of those 2 questions. Jim?
Well, I would say that on the role of faith and people being created equal, what I was talking about in terms of the emergence of developing countries is an intrusion of the fact that Chinese, Indians, and Africans are each asserting that they are equal, and they are demanding a different position in terms of economics and in terms of recognition. And that is why we moved to the G20, and as the Governor said, we may have to move to something else. I'm not sure that this is done because of belief in the Bible, I'm sad to say, but it is because of the pressure of economics, and I believe that that is happening. On the issue of the Arab countries and the role that they would play and the role that Israel would play, if I understood the question correctly because I couldn't quite hear it, it seems to me that Israel and the Arab countries have a great opportunity to come together in terms of opportunities for the next generation. If there is peace, there is a huge opportunity for an addition of the population in the Arab world with the technology and development skills of Israel. It will be advantageous for Israel. It will itself be a contribution to peace. And it's my hope that if we can under the current negotiations, if we could get rid of the Israel-Palestinian crisis, you will find more and more movement between Israel and the Arab world. This morning at breakfast, I was meeting with a group of Israelis who are already working in the Gulf, who are already working in Saudi Arabia, cannot send Israelis there, but could send people that they have hired who have American and other passports. Very, very conscious are the Arabs in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf that they're working with Israelis. But the more important thing is that they want the technology, whether it be in medicine or in agriculture or in other things. They're pragmatic because they have to deal with the question of their people. So I would hope that we will, in fact, have a greater development of the Israel-Arab relationships, but the issue of peace is paramount.
Thanks, Jim. That's a fitting sentence on which to conclude. It comes from somebody who was the special representative of the quartet in trying to promote the peace process, so it comes with even more authority than it might otherwise. I'd like to thank all the four panelists. We've had a very interesting session, and I would like to add, in thanking Axel, that the work program that he describes for the financial sector in Germany as a result of the crisis is essentially identical to the work program in Israel as a result of the crisis, and I hope we progress together. Thank you all very much.